Good afternoon, and thank you for coming out to our Climate Action Open Day. I hope you're enjoying learning things about the climate, speaking out, acting, and inspiring hope. And do take a moment to join our prayer vigil later too. I'm delighted at this point to be able to introduce the Reverend James Bhagwan, who's our guest speaker today. He has come all the way from Fiji to talk to us. So, no more ado, Reverend James.
The best part about standing up here is I get to do this. I don't know how we live like this anymore, but anyway. Okay, so in our Pacific context, we can really not start a conversation without creating relationship. And yes, I have come from Fiji all the way to meet you. And I'm going back tomorrow. No. As you may be aware, I'm on my way to Glasgow for the climate change conference, the negotiations, which we commonly call COP26. This is the 26th Conference of Parties for the United Nations framework on climate change, the Convention of Climate Change. And I want to begin, figure it out, by introducing myself and my family. So this is my family. These are the people I have left behind. These are those girls' cousins and aunt. My wife is Maylin. My children are Francisco and Antonia. And between us, those children's genetic makeup basically contain every major culture in our Pacific. We have Indo-Fijian from my father's ancestry that were brought by indentured laborers brought by the British colony to work in sugarcane plantations. My connection with the indigenous community through my mother from one of the northern islands of Fiji. My wife, who has English blood mixed with Fijian blood, mixed with Samoan blood, the Polynesian community, Kiribati, Melanesian community, and China, which is very far away. But that is, for me, a way to say that when I come here, I am not just Reverend James Bhagwan, the General Secretary of the Pacific Conference of Churches and the Minister of the Methodist Church in Fiji, but I come from a community. I come from a family. I come from people who have links across our Pacific Ocean. And I love my family. I love my country. I love my region. It is a beautiful place. I hope you all have a chance to visit. If not, you can just hear the stories from Luke and his family as they go to visit. But I'm here to talk about what's going on, how did we get here, and what is going to happen if the climate change negotiations fail. And more importantly, what happens if there is inaction in our world. I'm going to just skip through a couple of slides here, because when you think of the Pacific, when you think of our beautiful blue oceans, you don't usually think about this. This is a photo taken from what is known as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It is a bit of the Pacific Ocean, which is probably around the size of East Anglia, full of plastic, choking sea life. If you wonder where our rubbish goes when we don't dispose of it thoughtfully, this is where it ends up. It blows into rivers and drains and goes into the ocean and makes its way through currents into certain places. This is emblematic of the way that we are treating our planet. Out of mind is very often out of sight. And so very often we want things to be out of sight so that it can be out of mind. This is the other aspect. Increased dependency on fossil fuels. Not only are we seeing fossil fuels impacting the climate, as you've heard from carbon emissions, etc., as you've read on the boards here, but they're also destroying the ecosystems the fragile biodiversity of our Pacific Island countries and many other communities as well. And one of our challenges as Christians is often we look at our lives, our roles as the dominators of creation. Subdue creation, take it for our own use. But actually, if you go through the Hebrew translations of the command given to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, it is very much about be stewards of creation. We are not being good stewards. So climate change is the impact of our lack of good stewardship of the planet. And this is the result. This image symbolizes that every year we now experience the hottest year on record. So in the past it was like 2000 was the hottest year of record in X amount of years. But every year now is becoming the hottest year on record. We're not just experiencing it in the Pacific, people are experiencing it all over the world. This is a map from 7 years ago, just showing the heat on a particular day on our planet in 2014. We know the stories, particularly those of you in the Northern Hemisphere know about the Arctic and the melting of the polar ice caps. But this is what the impact is for us in the Pacific. This is where my wife and Luca's wife's families in Kiribati and Tuvalu are experiencing. This is what rising sea level looks like in our context. It is not an abstract situation. This is a lived reality for people. And these are the issues that we're facing as a result of climate change. We're experiencing extreme sea level rise, extreme weather. And I was sharing with some people earlier today how in the past we would have one Category 5 cyclone every few years, every number of years. And now it is a regular thing for us. In fact, I've been told that when we get back in the cyclone season in Fiji, when I reach home after COP26, we are expecting 2 to 3 Category 5 cyclones. So it's the norm now. We have increasing ocean temperatures, and the small image to the left of the screen is what happens in just a few months. In December 2014, the coral was healthy. By February the following year, so only 3 months later or 2 months later, depending on your sense of time, the coral was dying. Less than a year, the coral was dead. That means the whole ecosystem, that biodiversity, that life in the ocean is also affected. Because we all know about food chains. So if the small things die, then the things that feed on those small things die, and the things that feed on those ones die, and so on and so forth. And so we are finding now that when we go to fish, when our people go to fish, they're having to go further and further out to sea to find the fish. And the other, of course, the picture of the young man watching the tides come in at the king tide. They build the seawalls to protect the land. Unfortunately, when the tide comes with the rising seas, each time it's higher and higher. And my question is, how much higher are we expected to build our seawalls? A few years ago, there was a tsunami in Japan. You may have heard of this. This was around maybe 2011, maybe now, some while ago. Then we had this massive nuclear plant in Fukushima being affected as a result. In Fukushima, they had built a 2-meter seawall to protect it. The tsunami came in at 2.1 meters over the seawall. The water could not drain back out because of the seawall, and there was massive flooding and loss of life. And this is the next reality of our people. We used to use this word climate refugees. And in Europe, in the UK, we are aware of the situation of refugees. When there is conflict, when there is a disaster, people are displaced from one area and they move to someone else that is safer, where they can live. The difference is we no longer use this term refugees, because at the end of a conflict, those refugees can return home. At the end of natural disaster, when the land has recovered, people can return home. For our people in the Pacific, there is no real place to return to. We are seeing that by the next 50 years, if not earlier, certain parts of the Pacific, whole countries, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and others, will literally disappear from the map. That is going to be their reality. This tree is always a reminder to me of the reality of climate change in my neighborhood, the resilience that we can have, but also that if we do not change the way we are living, it's going to be too late for us. I want to talk a little bit about climate-induced displacement, because I want to share with you what the impacts of climate change are for people, the lived reality and the challenges that we face. In 2009, so 12 years ago now, the Pacific Church leaders had already started to talk about the impact of climate-induced displacement and relocation, and saying, as churches who have a pastoral role to our people, we need to be able to guide them, to speak with them, to be pastoral and provide care and support for them when these impacts really start to hit. And so we started talking about the role of the church in three very interesting situations. For those who cannot leave, people who will refuse to leave their sinking islands, quote unquote. What does it look like for those who will have to leave? And what also does it look like for those who will receive these communities? How do we have that sense of Christian radical hospitality and neighborhood where we are called to love our neighbor? Pacific people, and my brothers and sisters from Fiji who are here can attest to this, we have not only a strong cultural attachment to land, it is almost spiritual. And you think about the ancient people of these lands, this island, and their relationship to land. And so the destruction from a Category 5 cyclone is not just measured in terms of development setbacks or economic setbacks, but is seen as the very land in which they are connected to, part of their own identity being destroyed. And this is because of our sense of rootedness to place. Now, Joe and others here, I don't know about Luke, but many of our children, when they are born, when we come out of our mother's wombs and the nurses snips the umbilical cord, there's usually a little bit that sticks out, just sort of that much. Now, when it finally dries up and drops off, we have a custom all across the Pacific where we take that umbilical cord and it is buried in the soil with a tree, a seedling. Most common is a coconut tree, but it can be whatever is the tree that is common to our area or significant to our area. And that signifies that that child has a place of belonging, that that child's life is rooted in the land, that they have a place to which they belong and gives them a sense of identity. Now, what does that mean with rising seas when the land starts to disappear? This is not a room with a view. This was somebody's backyard that is now underwater. You can see on the I guess that's my right-hand side, the markers there, the stones show that was the extent of the coast before. And now this is how they're living, and they've had to move from these houses and relocate inland. But whose land do they relocate to? Who pays for this relocation? Who helps them in the trauma that they have to go through, that they experience when they have to uproot everything and move? And these are part of the challenges that we face. I'm sure many of us are familiar with this psalm, Psalm 137. And if you're not familiar with your psalms, you may remember the song, "By the rivers of Babylon." I grew up listening to that song more than reading it in the Bible. But this psalm resonates with our people because it is about that sense of exile. We are people who dance, sing, we love to celebrate life. How can we do that when we're experiencing this sense of loss of identity, loss of sovereignty, loss of future? There are islands that, as I said, will no longer exist on the map anymore. But what does that mean, not just in terms of identity, but in terms of citizenship? We're in the process of preparing people to be stateless because their island nation will no longer exist on a map. What's the value of that passport? Who do they then claim citizenship from? The church is called to be a people of transformation, people on journey. And so our work with the Pacific Conference of Churches, working with our member churches across the vast Pacific community, is about shifting from this concept of exile to the concept of exodus. That maybe, even if nothing is done, there still can be hope. And that's because as church, while we fight for justice, while we speak the truth, while we stand in solidarity with people who are losing everything, we must do our best to ensure that there is some hope, because that is the Christian message, that life, not death, will have the final say. And so there is a verse from Jeremiah, or a chapter from Jeremiah, which talks about how displaced communities can live. Let me just skip through this. This is a long presentation, so I'll skip to all this. And the other is about the spirituality of hospitality that we have to work with. As I said, places that people move to will already belong to somebody else. Either to indigenous communities who have that land, or if they have to move to another country, what does that mean for them? Does that mean that they go and become second-class citizens? Are they only there to be manual laborers? What is the dignity that these people experience? Where is that opportunity to have a life of dignity? And so these are some of the existential questions that we have to engage with. And we do that by reminding of the stories of what God told the Israelites during their journey in the desert. When you come into your land and you meet foreigners and you meet people who are suffering, remember that you too once suffered, and you too have to care for these people. And so we are talking about this sense of uprootedness. How do we as church gently care for these people in a pastoral way, that when they are taken from one place to another, it is done in a way that doesn't affect their dignity, is as least traumatic as possible, and gives them some hope and some dignity. Of course, that's the worst case scenario. We don't want it to reach to that point. And so what we need is what we term the ecological conversion from the throwaway culture. And so even in our own communities, we are teaching this. And this is about ways to be greener, ways to live in your community that are more in harmony with the planet, that are more sustainable practices, that have a less impact on the climate. And if we can do it, you can do it too. And your communities can do it. Imagine when we talk about this word that we are used to hearing called carbon footprint. Every time you hear climate change, you will hear, what is your carbon footprint? So I traveled from Fiji to LA, Los Angeles, from Los Angeles to Heathrow, and then to Berlin. And then I had meetings in Berlin. I took a train to Bremen in Germany for more meetings. And then to get to meetings in Geneva, Switzerland, I took 12 hours worth of train overnight to get there so that I would keep my carbon footprint low. And every stop on the way, I'm having meetings, I'm engaging with communities to try and reduce my carbon footprint. After all this travel, 6 weeks away from home, when I finally get back, I and one of my colleagues, who will be joining me in Glasgow tomorrow, will go to some land that our church organization has purchased and plant 70 trees as a way of offsetting our carbon footprint. Now, that's great. Well done, James. But the carbon footprint of the Pacific does not even equate to the nail on your small toe in terms of the rest of the world. And here we are, people with this tiny, tiny footprint, bearing the impact of everybody else's carbon footprint. And so when we talk about climate change, it is a question of justice. Why are we, who struggle and do our best to live in harmony with creation, where we use our faith, our culture, our tradition to tell us to live in harmony with the environment, to be as gentle as possible, why do we have to suffer for the sins of others? Have you ever thought about naming climate change as a sin? Because we as a human race, the word sin means to miss the mark. And every time we don't have strong commitments at COP26, every time the conversations prolong and the 1.5 degree that we need to maintain gets further and further away, we are missing the mark. And so the developed nations of the world, there's only one word to describe that. It's sin. These are the people doing as much as they can to change even the small ways in which they've been negatively impacting their communities environmentally. I shared with one of our friends here today that the bulk of the work that we're talking about in terms of carbon emissions are carbon emissions that go into the air. But the bulk of carbon emissions that are affecting the planet actually takes place on the ocean, because most of the world's trade takes place on ships. And so one of the things that we're going to lobby for, and we've been doing this for a number of years in the COP meetings, is to include the issue of oceans in the conversation about climate change. Can you imagine 26 years and they still are not talking about the impact of the carbon emissions into the sea, where 90% of the world's trade takes place on the ocean? Yesterday I was at the Bank of England for a National Climate Justice Memorial. And I stood on the steps of the Royal Exchange. And I shared with the people there, and many of them did not know that at the top of the Royal Exchange, right at the top, there is a little triangle with a verse from the Bible written on it. Psalm 24, verse 1. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. It took me a while. First I was reflecting. I was sort of, that's interesting. And the more and more I thought about it, the more disgusted I got. How dare they take this verse talking about the earth is the Lord's and so much injustice is done. Investment in fossil fuels, investment in things that continue to desecrate the environment for the sake of what? Not God's glory, but for greed and for profit. And so there is a need for us to make these big shifts in our way of living. I'm a chaplain for this particular boat. This is the Uto Ni Yalo. It means heart of the spirit. It is a traditional voyaging canoe reminding us that 1,000 years before Christ, our ancestors were sailing on ships twice as big as this, if not 3 times, across the ocean, using not GPS, not latitude and longitude, not sextants, but using stars, celestial navigation. But we have been told that that way is not the right way. And so there is part of us that we need to say, how do we live in more harmony with nature, with God's creation? How do we remember and practice the fact that we are part of God's creation and that we are stewards of God's creation? And so I come back to this ecological conversion, because this is something that each one of us can do. You know, while you pray for us and the negotiations that take place in Glasgow in the next 2 weeks, while you sign up to petitions to call your pension funds, etc., to divest from fossil fuel investments, conversion is a return to restored relationship with God and with God's creation. It is a return to recognizing that we live in the oikos, the whole household of God. And this journey that you have taken as a community since September the 1st has been part of the season of creation, with the theme around God's household, the oikos. And so we must continue to talanoa. Talanoa is the sharing of stories, the sharing of truths with one another. We must continue to cry together, to dream together, to plan and act to restore our common home. And the work now begins on restoring our common home, but it can only be done if all of us, every single one of us, and your friends, your families, the people you meet, the people you work with, regardless of whatever room we call ours in the household of God, commit to caring for the whole household. I would like you all to take a deep breath. Hopefully we can do that in here. If you could, after me, take a deep breath. Ready? And one more. And out. The first breath you took was created, the oxygen was created by the trees in the Amazon, around here. But every second breath you take comes from the ocean. More and more now, 70% plus of the world's oxygen is created in our ocean, which is under threat from climate change. So every second breath you take, enjoy it, because not for too long, it may be gone. Thank you very much for your time. Bless you all.
Kind of the only thing I can say is, wow, and thank you. On top of those 2 breaths, it's worth remembering that each breath is an inspiration. And one of the elements of our programme is that we are seeking to learn in order that we don't hold on to that learning, but we speak out in exactly the same way as James has shared both the challenge and the hope. And when we speak out, it's total hypocrisy unless we act. There's lots of speaking out you can do there. There's lots of acting you can do there. And if you need more learning, read the posters over there. And if that has not inspired you to pop into the prayer vigil and talk to Robin and look at some of the slides that we'll put back up in a moment. But I want to share just one time with everything, because I can go on wax lyrical about this just as much as James can. I want to share just one thing with you. That when James was being interviewed by Rookies, his comment was that he needed the support of his family locally and his friends locally to persuade him to come to Glasgow, because he lost that expectation that something would happen, because it has been there so many times before. And James shared with us the importance of his support locally that pushed him to go in. And I would just comment that I too, and I hope you have felt that sense of welcome and refreshment that James has brought to us to give us a new challenge to move forwards. But also a reminder that us being here is part of the spirit that James takes with him, that buoys him in his expectation that the Pacific Islands and others in the developing nations are not alone. And my final message is that UK was the source of industrialisation. And in our letter, that I want you to put your name on the list over there, our letter to Boris, we are saying, as the source of leading the world into industrialisation, we must also be the source of leading ourselves out of the consequences. And whatever agreement is reached in Glasgow, it's up to the UK government to fight harder, to do more, to fund more, so that people in Fiji and other parts like Fiji will have more support, more encouragement, but also so that we can, as we have done in history, lead the world into a place in which people are able to live more satisfied and fulfilled lives full of inspiration. There is hope in what we're doing. There is hope in what we're doing. There is an answer to everything if only we're willing to work in community and in partnership. Thank you. And thank you all. Are we going to take a few questions, or are we going to leave it that we've taken more of your time? And I'm sure everybody is delighted in what you've shared with us, and terrified by what you've shared with us at one level, and moved to do something like making a pledge, signing a petition, learning more, and having a prayer. Thank you all.